The alarm in my chest went off before any alarm on the ship did. I was standing in the observation bay of the long horizon when the shuttle doors opened, and a small human girl walked out alone, dragging a soft blue bag behind her, looking at our ship the way the rest of us look at a garden, not a warship, a garden. My name is Yeshni. I am a systems engineer, third-generation Korvath, and I have served on this vessel for 6 full cycles. I have seen storms tear open cargo bays. I have seen crew members freeze in fear during a hull breach drill. I thought I understood fear, and I thought I understood calm. I did not understand either until that day. The girl's name, we would learn moments later, was Ivy. Ivy Sutton, 9 years old, daughter of Ambassador Daniel Sutton, who was already halfway down the corridor, speaking quickly with Captain Vesic about treaty language and mineral rights and things that mattered to grown men in grey suits. He barely glanced back at his daughter. "She will be fine here," he said, not really asking. "She has been on worse ships than this." Worse ships than this. I remember turning that phrase over in my head like a stone with a sharp edge. The Long Horizon was not a pleasure cruiser. She was built for patrol duty along contested space, armored in places most transport vessels were not, with drills and simulations designed to keep a crew sharp for the day. Something out there in the dark decided to test us. We did not carry children. We did not know what to do with one. Captain Vesic, to his credit, tried to be diplomatic about it. He knelt down, which for a thrall of his size and rank was no small gesture, and asked the girl if she was frightened to be aboard a ship full of aliens. Ivy looked around at the crew gathered near the airlock. At Tren, our navigator, whose skin shimmers faintly blue under stress. At Oru, from engineering, whose 4 eyes were fixed on her the way you might watch an unexploded shell. At me. She looked at all of us, tilted her head, and said, "No, everyone here has a face." That's usually a good sign. Nobody knew what to say to that. Vesic straightened, cleared his throat, and gestured for 2 of the junior crew, myself included, to take her to the guest quarters near the medical bay. It was meant to be simple. Watch the child. Keep her fed, keep her calm, keep her out of restricted areas, and return her to her father in a few hours once the negotiations concluded. A babysitting duty. The kind of assignment that junior officers dread not because it is difficult, but because it is beneath them. I did not expect it to be the most unsettling shift of my career. The first sign that something was different came in the corridor. Our ship runs on artificial gravity fields, and near certain junctions, especially close to the engine core, there are pressure variances that cause a faint hum and a subtle pull, barely perceptible to most species, uncomfortable to some. Threll younglings cry when they pass through it. Korvath hatchlings refuse to walk that corridor at all until they are much older. Ivy Sutton walked through it without changing her pace. She did not even seem to notice. "Does that not bother you?" I asked her, because I could not help myself. She looked up at me, genuinely puzzled. Does what bother me? The pull, near the core junction. Most young ones feel it. She shrugged, the small motion of someone who has never once considered the question important. I get carsick sometimes. This isn't that. I filed that away, carsick, a word I did not fully understand yet, but one that would come to mean something very different to me by the end of that day. We brought her to the guest quarters, a small room usually reserved for visiting diplomats, with a bunk, a viewport, and very little else. She set her blue bag on the bunk, unzipped it, and pulled out a small tablet, a stuffed animal shaped vaguely like a bear, and a deck of cards held together with a rubber band. "You can just sit there," she told us, pointing at 2 chairs near the door, as if we were the ones who needed instructions. "I don't need anything. I'm used to waiting." Oru, beside me, made a low clicking sound that Korvath make when we are trying to process something that does not fit our expectations. Used to waiting for what, exactly? "My dad does this a lot," Ivy said, settling onto the bunk and crossing her legs beneath her. "Meetings, conferences. Sometimes it's boring places, sometimes it's not boring places." She said this last part with the faintest, almost invisible flicker of amusement, and I did not understand it then, but I understand it now. She was talking about places far more dangerous than our ship, and she was talking about them the way another child might talk about a rainy afternoon. Word travels fast on a ship this size. Within the hour, half the off-duty crew had found some excuse to walk past the guest quarters, peering through the open door at the strange little human sitting cross-legged on the bunk, playing a card game against herself, humming a tune none of us recognized. Some of them were curious. A few, I am ashamed to admit, were something closer to cruel, in that lazy, thoughtless way that boredom sometimes creates. There is an old habit among certain crews, particularly among species who have encountered many fragile, timid younglings from softer worlds, of testing the newest, youngest visitor, not out of malice exactly, more out of a desire to see a reaction, to confirm what everyone already assumed about small, unarmored creatures from quiet worlds. Petty Officer Wren, a broad-shouldered thrall with a reputation for pranks that were funnier to him than to anyone else, leaned against the doorway with a grin that I did not like. "I've heard humans startle easy," he said, to no one in particular, though he was clearly speaking for Ivy's benefit. "Heard they cry over almost nothing." Ivy did not look up from her cards. "Who told you that?" "Word travels." "Word's wrong," she said simply, and placed another card down with the calm precision of someone playing a much bigger game than the one in front of her. Wren's grin widened, the way a grin widens right before someone does something they will later regret. He glanced at me and Oru, some silent challenge passing between the three of us, and I felt the first cold thread of unease settle into my stomach. Not for Ivy, for what Wren might do next, and for what it might mean for our ship if the ambassador's daughter left this vessel upset, or worse, harmed by our own crew's carelessness. "I'm just saying," Wren continued, stepping into the room, "a ship like this can be a lot for a little thing like you. Lots of strange sounds, strange lights, emergency systems. You ever hear our breach alarm?" For the first time since she'd boarded, Ivy looked up fully, and her eyes, calm and clear and far older than her face, moved slowly around the room, taking in the reinforced walls, the emergency panel by the door, the faint hum of the ship's systems running beneath the floor. "You mean the alarm that means something's actually wrong," she said, "or the one you play as a joke to scare new people?" Wren's grin faltered, just slightly, just enough that I noticed. "How would you know the difference?" "Because a real one doesn't wait for an audience," she said. The room went quiet. Even Oru's clicking stopped. It was such a small thing to say, and yet it landed like something much larger. I remember looking at her then, this small human child sitting cross-legged on a bunk on a warship full of strangers from a dozen worlds, calmly sorting a deck of cards, and thinking that something about this entire situation did not add up. Every instinct I had, built over 6 cycles of service, told me that a 9-year-old alone on an alien vessel should show some sign of unease, a flicker of fear, a moment of homesickness, something. There was nothing. Not fear, not bravado, not the performance of courage that frightened children sometimes put on for adults, just a strange, settled calm, the calm of someone who had already decided, long before boarding this ship, that whatever happened here was unlikely to be the worst thing she would face that year. Wren straightened, recovering some of his swagger, though I could tell it cost him something. "We'll see," he said, and left the room with a look on his face that I recognized immediately because I had seen it before, right before pranks and tests and dares that junior crew liked to play on each other. He was going to try something. I did not know what yet, but I knew it was coming, and I knew, with a certainty I could not explain, that it was not going to go the way he expected. I should have warned him. I should have told him to leave well enough alone. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and some small, dishonorable part of me wanted to see what would happen too. Oru turned to me once Wren was gone, his 4 eyes blinking in an asynchronous pattern that meant he was thinking hard. "Something is wrong with this child," he said quietly, in our own language, assuming she could not understand us. "Wrong how? She is not acting like a youngling who is far from home, surrounded by strangers, aboard a machine built for war." He paused. "She is acting like someone who has already survived worse than this, and is simply waiting to see if we will manage to catch up." I did not have an answer for him. I only had the same unease sitting low in my chest, the same sense that we had been handed something we did not fully understand, wrapped in the shape of a small girl with a stuffed bear and a deck of cards. Ivy, unaware of our conversation, or perhaps simply unbothered by it either way, finished her game, gathered her cards, and looked toward the viewport, where the stars stretched out cold and endless beyond the reinforced glass. "How long until my dad's done talking?" she asked, in standard this time, clearly for our benefit. "Several hours most likely," I told her. "Ambassadorial negotiations move slowly." She nodded, entirely unsurprised, and pulled the stuffed bear into her lap. "Okay," she said. "Then I guess we've got time to kill." She said it lightly, the way anyone might, but something about the phrase settled strangely in the room, and none of us, not me, not Oru, not even the ship itself humming quietly around us, seemed quite ready for what those hours were about to become. Outside, in the corridor, I could hear Ren's voice, low and conspiratorial, speaking with two other crew members. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the tone, planning, preparing, building towards something they thought would finally get a reaction out of the strange, calm little human sitting in our guest quarters. I did not know it then, but they were about to learn something that every soldier, every diplomat, and every cautious species across known space would eventually learn about humans and about the worlds that raised them. They were about to learn that calm is not the same as unprepared. And children who grow up on a Deathworld do not startle the way you expect them to. I stayed near the door, watching Ivy hum quietly to herself as she rearranged her cards, and I felt, for the first time in 6 cycles of service, genuinely unsure of what was going to happen next aboard my own ship. That uncertainty, I would soon learn, was only the beginning. The lights in the corridor dimmed without warning, and my first thought was that something had actually gone wrong with the ship. My second thought, arriving half a second later, was Ren. I stepped out of the guest quarters just as the corridor lighting shifted to a low amber glow, the kind reserved for atmospheric simulations in the training bay 2 decks below. A holographic emitter had been wheeled into position near the far end of the hall, its lens already humming with the faint charge of activation. Ren stood beside it, arms crossed, doing a poor job of looking casual. "What are you doing?" I asked him, though I already suspected the answer. "Running a little demonstration," he said, "for our guest." Behind me, Ivy appeared in the doorway of the guest quarters, stuffed bear tucked under one arm, watching the amber-lit corridor with the mild curiosity of someone who has just noticed the weather has changed. "A demonstration of what?" she asked. Ren's smile returned, wider this time, more confident, the kind of smile a person wears when they believe they already know how a scene is going to end. "Something native to my homeworld," he said. "A predator most younglings find quite memorable." I should have stopped it there. I had the rank, technically, to override a junior officer's unauthorized use of training equipment, and I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that involving a 9-year-old human child in an unsanctioned simulation without her father's consent was exactly the kind of decision that could end careers. But curiosity, again, that same dishonorable curiosity, kept my mouth shut a moment too long. "It's fine," Ivy said, before I could decide what to do. "I like watching things." Ren's grin twitched, just slightly, as though her calm agreement had thrown him off some internal script he'd been rehearsing. He recovered quickly, gesturing toward the emitter, and the corridor filled with a low mechanical whir as the holographic projection began to take shape. The creature that emerged was, I will admit, an effective choice. A skrellhound, native to Ren's homeworld, all long limbs and low growling posture, with 6 eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, and claws that scraped audibly against the deck plating as it prowled forward. Threll younglings, famously, are terrified of skrellhounds. It is practically a cultural rite of passage among Ren's people, showing the projection to children just old enough to understand what fear is. The hologram stalked slowly down the corridor, head low, growl building, its glowing eyes fixed directly on Ivy. Oru, beside me, made a soft clicking sound of concern. 2 other crew members who had gathered to watch took an involuntary step backward, despite knowing, logically, that the creature was nothing more than light and sound. Ivy watched it approach with her head tilted slightly, the same expression she might have worn watching rain slide down a window, when the projection was perhaps 10 meters away, close enough that its low growl vibrated faintly through the deck plating. She crouched down slightly, studying its gait. "Its back legs are too stiff," she said. "Real predators don't move like that. They keep their weight low and loose, so they can change direction fast." Ren blinked. "It's not meant to be studied. It's meant to be frightening." "I know," Ivy said, not unkindly. "I'm just saying, if you wanted to actually scare someone, you should fix the legs." The Skrellhound projection let out a deeper growl, closing the distance, its holographic claws scraping against the deck in a way that was, admittedly, quite convincing. Ren adjusted a control on his wrist device, and the creature lunged forward several meters in a burst of simulated speed, exactly the kind of sudden motion designed to trigger a flinch reflex in almost any species. Ivy did not flinch. She straightened slightly, watching the lunge with something that looked almost like professional interest. "Can you make it go faster?" she asked. The corridor went very quiet. "Faster," Ren repeated, as though the word did not quite fit in his mouth. "Yeah, that was slow. If something's actually trying to catch you, it doesn't telegraph the lunge like that. It commits from further back, and it doesn't slow down right before, the way yours just did." She pointed at the projection, which had paused mid-stalk, awaiting Ren's next command. "You paused it right before the strike. Real predators don't hesitate. That's the part that's supposed to be scary, the not knowing when it commits." Oru's 4 eyes had gone very wide, and even in the dim amber light I could see the faint shimmer along his neck ridges that Korvath display when deeply unsettled. Ren, to his credit, tried to recover his footing. "Maybe you just don't understand what you're looking at," he said. "This isn't a toy. Where you're from, there's nothing like this." Ivy tilted her head again, and for the first time since she'd boarded the long horizon, something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of patient amusement, the look an adult gives a child who has confidently gotten something backwards. "Where I'm from," she said, "there's a lot like this. Bigger, mostly. And they don't wait for someone to program them to look scary. They just are." She reached out, unbothered, and passed her hand directly through the holographic projection's snapping jaws, as it lunged forward again, the light scattering harmlessly around her fingers. "This is a good projector, though," she added, almost as an afterthought, studying the way the light dispersed. "The detail on the fur is really good. What resolution is this running at?" Nobody answered her. Nobody, I think, quite knew what to say. Ren deactivated the projection with a sharp motion, and the corridor lights slowly returned to their normal brightness, the amber glow fading, the mechanical growl cutting off mid-sound. He stood there for a moment, wrist device still raised, looking at Ivy with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not embarrassment exactly, something closer to the beginning of understanding, the first crack in a belief he had not realized he was holding until it broke. "You've seen real predators," he said slowly. It was not quite a question. "Sure," Ivy said, shrugging as she stepped back into the guest quarters, the moment already passing for her, already filed away as unremarkable. "Haven't you?" "Not outside of simulations," Ren admitted. "Huh." She considered this with the mild surprise of someone learning a small, interesting fact about geography. That must be nice. She said it without malice, without any awareness that the comment had landed like a stone dropped into still water. To her, it was simply true, an observation about the difference between our worlds, no more significant than noting that one planet had 2 moons and another had none. To the rest of us, standing in that corridor in the aftermath of a failed scare tactic, it meant something much larger, though none of us could yet articulate exactly what. Oru pulled me aside once Ivy had disappeared back into the guest quarters, his voice low, his 4 eyes fixed on the closed door. "Yeshni," he said, "I do not think that was bravado. I know. I have seen bravado. Younglings who pretend not to be afraid because they are ashamed to be afraid. This was not that. She was not pretending anything." "I know," I said again, because it was the only honest answer I had. "Then what was it?" I did not answer him because I did not yet have the words for it. I only had the growing, uncomfortable sense that we had made a serious miscalculation, somewhere back at the very beginning, when we decided that a small human child on our ship was something to be tested rather than something to be understood. Ren, for his part, did not try again immediately. He retreated down the corridor with his emitter, muttering something about resolution settings and fur rendering, clearly rattled in a way he was trying hard not to show. But I noticed, later, that he did not stop thinking about it either. I saw him twice more that day, standing near the guest quarters, watching Ivy through the open door, with an expression that had shifted from mischief to something closer to genuine curiosity, maybe even the first threads of respect. It would not be the last attempt to unsettle her. If anything, Ren's failure only made others more determined to succeed where he had not, convinced that a better simulation, a sharper scare, a more dramatic scenario would finally produce the reaction everyone had expected from the moment she boarded. I did not share their confidence. Standing outside that door, replaying the calm, almost clinical way she had critiqued the Predator's movement pattern, I found myself thinking instead about what kind of childhood produces a 9-year-old capable of watching a snarling creature lunge toward her and respond with feedback on its gait. I did not know the answer yet, but I was beginning to suspect that whatever it was, it would change the way every person on this ship thought about humans, long after Ambassador Sutton's negotiations concluded and his daughter's shuttle departed our hangar bay for the last time. For now, though, the amber lights had faded, the corridor had returned to its ordinary hum, and somewhere behind a closed door, a small girl had gone back to sorting her cards, entirely unaware that she had just quietly rewritten what an entire ship's crew believed about fear. It would not be the last time that day she did exactly that. 20 minutes later, the deck tilted, the lights snapped to red, and somewhere down the corridor, a child who was not Ivy Sutton began to scream. For one terrible second, I thought it was real. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up, before I registered the pattern of the alarm, the specific cadence that meant simulation rather than emergency. By the time I reached the junction outside the training bay, I understood exactly what had happened, and I felt something close to anger rising in my chest for the first time that day. Someone had escalated things. Not Ren this time. It was Lieutenant Farrow, a Threll officer with more rank and less excuse, who had apparently decided that a single failed prank was not evidence enough that the human girl was simply unusual, but rather a challenge to be solved with a bigger simulation. He had activated a full emergency drill sequence, the kind normally reserved for crew training, complete with sudden gravity fluctuations, blaring hull breach alarms, artificial smoke pumped through the ventilation system, and flickering emergency lighting designed to disorient rather than illuminate. It was, by any reasonable standard, an excessive thing to unleash on visiting children, and it had clearly succeeded in terrifying at least one of them. The screaming child was not human. She was a young Vretani, daughter of a trade envoy also aboard for the negotiations, no older than 7, who had apparently wandered near the training bay at exactly the wrong moment and been caught in the drill's opening sequence. She was curled against the corridor wall now, hands pressed over her ears, her small frame shaking as the alarm continued to wail and red emergency lighting strobed across the smoke-filled corridor. Ivy was already crouched beside her. I do not know exactly when she had arrived, only that by the time I pushed through the gathering crowd of alarmed crew members, she was already there, sitting calmly on the deck plating beside the crying Vretani girl, speaking to her in a low, steady voice that somehow carried clearly beneath the blaring alarm. "Hey!" she was saying. "Hey, look at me. It's not real. It's a drill. See the lights? They're red, but they're not flashing the emergency pattern. They're flashing the practice pattern. There's a difference. Look." The Vretani girl, whose name I would later learn was Sela, lowered her hands slightly, peering through tear-filled eyes at the strobing lights above them. "How do you know?" Sela asked, her voice small and shaking. "Because real emergency lights don't blink evenly like that," Ivy said. "They pulse in bursts, because the system's trying to conserve power for other things. This is just the drill program running on a loop. It's not smart enough to be scary on purpose. It's just loud. It should not have worked. I have run crew drills myself, and I know how disorienting the combination of noise, smoke, and shifting gravity can be. even for trained adults who understand intellectually that nothing is truly wrong. And yet, slowly, Sela's shaking began to ease, her breathing evening out as she focused on the calm, steady presence of the human girl beside her rather than the chaos surrounding them both. "What's your name?" Ivy asked her, still in that same low, even tone. "Sela. I'm Ivy. Can you stand up for me, Sela? We're going to walk together, okay? Not run. Running in smoke is bad. You breathe in more of it that way. We walk, and we stay low, because the air's clearer near the floor." I watched, along with a dozen other crew members who had gathered in stunned silence, as a 9-year-old human girl guided a terrified 7-year-old Vertani through a simulated emergency corridor with the calm competence of someone who had done this before, who perhaps had done this many times before, in situations that were not simulations at all. "How do you know all that?" I heard Pharaoh ask, his voice caught somewhere between authority and genuine bewilderment as Ivy led Sela past him, toward clearer air near the junction. Ivy glanced up at him, unbothered by his rank, unbothered by the chaos around them, unbothered, it seemed, by anything at all. "We do fire drills at school," she said, as though this explained everything. "And storm drills, and a few other kinds. You learn the rules pretty fast when the alternative is not knowing them." "A few other kinds," Pharaoh repeated. "Yeah," she said it simply, without elaboration, the way someone mentions a mildly inconvenient fact about their commute. "Anyway, can you turn this off? Sela's scared, and there's no reason for her to be, if it's not a real emergency." I do not think Pharaoh had considered, until that exact moment, that his demonstration might have a cost beyond simply failing to frighten the intended target. I watched the realization settle over his face as he looked at Sela, still trembling slightly despite Ivy's steadying presence, and I saw something in his expression that I recognized as shame. He deactivated the drill sequence. The alarms cut off mid-wail, the red lighting shifted back to standard illumination, and the ventilation system began clearing the artificial smoke with an audible hum. The sudden silence felt almost louder than the alarm had been. Sela's mother arrived moments later, alerted by another crew member, and swept her daughter into her arms with the particular fierce relief of a parent who has just learned their child was frightened while under someone else's supervision. She said very little to Pharaoh, but the look she gave him needed no translation across species. Ivy, meanwhile, had already turned her attention elsewhere, crouching down to examine the residual smoke still clinging to the lower corridor, running her fingers through it thoughtfully. "This stuff's not toxic, right?" she asked, to no one in particular. "It smells synthetic. Good. Real smoke's worse. It gets into your lungs faster than people think, especially structure fires. This is basically just fog with a smell added." "You seem to know a great deal about smoke inhalation for a child your age," I said, finally finding my voice, though it came out quieter and more unsettled than I intended. Ivy looked up at me, and for just a moment something flickered behind her calm expression, something that might have been the memory of a specific afternoon, a specific fire, a specific set of instructions shouted by an adult in a specific emergency that was not a drill at all. It passed quickly, replaced again by that same easy, unbothered composure. "You learn it in school," she said again, and I understood, somehow, that this answer, while true, was not the whole truth, and that pressing further would not get me any closer to it. Pharaoh approached us slowly, his earlier bravado entirely gone, replaced by something more careful, more genuinely curious. "I apologize," he said, addressing Ivy directly, an unusual gesture for an officer of his rank toward a child of any species. That was reckless. I did not consider that another child might be affected. Ivy shrugged, already moving past the moment the way she seemed to move past most moments, without lingering resentment, without drama. "It's okay. Just maybe don't run drills near little kids without warning people first. Sela's 7. She probably hasn't done a lot of these yet, and you have," Pharaoh said. It was not quite a question this time either. "I mean, everybody has. Where I'm from," Ivy said, with a small shrug that suggested she genuinely did not understand why this kept surprising us. "Storms happen, sometimes worse things happen. You learn what to do so you don't panic when they do. I exchanged a glance with Oru, who had appeared at some point during the chaos, and was now watching Ivy with an expression of dawning, unsettled comprehension. Farro looked similarly affected, his earlier confidence replaced by the particular quiet of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about the person standing in front of them. Word of the incident spread through the ship faster than any official report could have managed. By the time we returned Ivy to the guest quarters, considerably later than planned given the unscheduled detour through Farrow's drill sequence, there was a small, unofficial audience gathered nearby, crew members finding reasons to be in the corridor, watching the strange, calm human girl with something that had shifted, in the space of a single afternoon, from amusement to caution to something closer to respectful uncertainty. Ivy did not seem to notice the shift in attention, or if she did, she gave no indication that it mattered to her. She settled back onto the bunk in the guest quarters, pulled her deck of cards back out, and glanced toward me and Oru, with the faint, patient expression of someone who has grown used to being watched, and has decided long ago that it is not worth the energy to be bothered by it. "Is it always this exciting here?" she asked, "or did I just get lucky?" Oru's 4 eyes blinked in their asynchronous pattern, and beside me, I felt the same unease I had been carrying since the moment she boarded, now grown into something larger, something closer to a genuine, creeping realization that we had fundamentally misunderstood what we were dealing with. "Lucky," I said, because I could not think of anything else to say. Ivy smiled, small and knowing, and shuffled her cards. That's not what it looked like from where I was standing. Behind her, through the viewport, the stars continued their slow, silent drift, indifferent to the quiet unraveling of every assumption our crew had carried about small, soft creatures from distant, gentler worlds. I did not yet understand how thoroughly that unraveling had only just begun. I only knew, standing in that doorway with the smell of synthetic smoke still faintly clinging to the corridor air, that the rest of the afternoon was going to look very different from how it had started. I was right. I simply had no idea, at the time, exactly how different. It was Oru who finally asked the question none of us had been brave enough to ask directly. We had gathered, an increasingly large and increasingly quiet group of crew members, in the small common area adjoining the guest quarters, ostensibly to monitor the human child, but really, if I am honest, because none of us wanted to be anywhere else. Something about the afternoon's events had pulled at a thread none of us could quite stop pulling, and Ivy Sutton sat at the center of it all, entirely at ease, sorting her cards into some private, orderly system, while a dozen alien crew members watched her like she was a puzzle box none of them could figure out how to open. "May I ask you something?" Oru said, settling into the chair across from her with careful, deliberate movements, the way he might approach an unfamiliar piece of equipment he suspected could be dangerous. "Sure," Ivy said, not looking up. "Why does none of this frighten you? The alarms, the simulations, even the accident with Sela, which frightened her considerably. You remained calm through all of it. I do not ask to mock you. I ask because I genuinely do not understand, and I would like to." Ivy set down her cards, finally, and looked at him with an expression that was, for the first time that day, thoughtful rather than simply patient. She seemed to be genuinely considering the question, turning it over the way she'd turned over the Skrellhound's stiff gate earlier, examining it for its actual mechanics rather than its surface. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense to you," she said finally. "It's not that I'm brave. I don't feel brave. It's just, none of this is really that different from normal stuff for me." "Normal stuff," Oru repeated carefully. "Yeah, like the alarm thing. We get storm warnings back home sometimes. Real ones, not drills, where you have maybe 10 minutes to get to shelter before things get bad. So a fake alarm on a ship, even a loud one, it's not the real thing. My body doesn't really react to it the same way, because some part of me already knows what real actually feels like." I found myself leaning forward slightly, along with several others in the room, all of us drawn in by the quiet, matter-of-fact way she described things that, to us, sounded extraordinary. "And the Predator simulation," Ren said from near the doorway, his earlier swagger entirely gone now, replaced by genuine curiosity. He had lingered near the guest quarters for most of the afternoon, unable, it seemed, to fully walk away from the mystery he had accidentally uncovered. "You said you'd seen real predators. What did you mean by that?" Ivy shrugged, the gesture small and unbothered. "There's stuff where I live, not in the city, but where my grandparents live, out in the country. Big cats, bears in some places. You learn to make noise when you're hiking, so you don't surprise them. You learn what to do if you see one, which is mostly, don't run, because running makes them chase you, and you can't outrun something that's built to be faster than you." The room had gone very quiet. Even the ambient hum of the ship's systems seemed to fade into the background as every crew member present processed the casual, almost bored way this 9-year-old girl was describing what sounded, to every alien in that room, like a series of near-catastrophic encounters treated as mundane childhood knowledge. "How many times," Oru asked slowly, "have you actually seen one of these predators? In person, not in a simulation?" Ivy thought about it for a moment, counting silently on her fingers in a way that made my stomach tighten with each passing second. "Maybe 4 times, 5, if you count the one that was really far away and probably didn't even notice us." "5, Faro said, his voice strained. "You have encountered a dangerous predator, in person, 5 times, and you are 9 years old." "I mean, that's not that many," Ivy said, and there was no bravado in the statement, no attempt to impress us. She genuinely seemed to believe this was an unremarkable number, the kind of statistic that would not raise an eyebrow among her peers back home. "My cousin's seen way more than that. He lives even further out." I exchanged a look with Oru that I am certain mirrored the look passing between half the crew members in that room. It was not fear, exactly, not yet. It was something more foundational than fear, a kind of vertigo, the sensation of standing on ground you believed was solid and suddenly realizing it was not. "Where I am from," I said slowly, choosing my words with unusual care, "younglings are kept away from anything remotely dangerous until they are fully grown. It is considered, among my people, a basic responsibility of a caretaker to ensure a child never encounters true danger until they are old enough to understand and manage it properly." "That sounds nice," Ivy said, and she meant it. I could tell. There was no sarcasm in her voice at all. "Kind of impossible where I'm from, though. There's a lot of nature, and nature doesn't really care how old you are. Does that not seem," Oru began, then paused, searching for the right word, "unreasonable, to you? That your world would allow children to grow up around such danger?" Ivy considered this seriously, tilting her head in that thoughtful way that had already become familiar to me over the course of the afternoon. "I don't think anyone decided to allow it, exactly," she said. "It's just how it is. You can't really uninvent bears. You just learn to live carefully instead. My mom says humans have always been kind of good at that, learning to live carefully around things that could hurt us, instead of pretending those things don't exist." The phrase settled over the room like something heavy, though I do not think Ivy intended it to. She said it simply, the way she said most things, a small true fact passed along without much weight attached to it on her end. But I felt the weight of it settle into my own chest all the same, and glancing around the room, I could see the same reaction mirrored on the faces of the crew gathered there. "You said earlier you wanted to show us something," Ren said, breaking the silence, his voice quieter and more careful than I had heard it all day. "A game, from home." I remembered then the offhand comment Ivy had made hours earlier, before the Skrellhound simulation, before the drill sequence, before any of the afternoon's revelations had begun to accumulate into the strange, unsettling picture now forming in all of our minds. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that she and her friends played games back home, and that she would show us some time if we were curious. Ivy brightened slightly at the reminder, the first genuinely excited expression I had seen from her all day. "Oh yeah. I could show you, if you want. It's more fun to actually see it than to just hear me talk about it." "Show us how?" Oru asked. "There is no simulation equipment calibrated for human recreational activities aboard this ship." "I don't need equipment," Ivy said. "I can just tell you the rules, and maybe act some of it out. It's simple. Most kids' games are simple, that's kind of the point." I felt, in that moment, a peculiar mixture of curiosity and dread settle over me, though I could not have said exactly why the dread was there. Perhaps it was some instinct built from the accumulated weight of everything I had already witnessed that day, some quiet warning that whatever this girl considered an ordinary childhood game might land very differently on a ship full of adults who had just spent the last several hours slowly discovering that their assumptions about human fragility were entirely, catastrophically wrong. "We would like to see it," Pharaoh said, before I could voice any hesitation, his earlier embarrassment apparently replaced now by genuine, almost desperate curiosity to understand the creature sitting so calmly among us. Ivy grinned, the expression bright and completely unguarded, the first time all day she had looked, simply and entirely, like the 9-year-old child she actually was. "Okay," she said, hopping down from the bunk and stretching her arms. "But you have to promise not to freak out. It's not that scary, it's just a game." I remember thinking, in that moment, that her reassurance did very little to settle the growing unease in my chest. If anything, it deepened it, because everything else she had described that day as ordinary, as unremarkable, as simply how things were where she came from, had already proven to be far more than any of us had expected. I did not know, as she cleared a space in the center of the small common room and began explaining the rules with the easy enthusiasm of a child sharing something she loved, that I was about to understand, more completely than any briefing document or diplomatic report ever could, exactly what humanity's presence in the wider galaxy was going to mean for the rest of us. I only knew that the room had gone very still, every alien crew member present leaning slightly forward, caught somewhere between curiosity and a dread none of us could yet name, waiting to see what a human child considered, without any apparent exaggeration at all, simply how kids played. "Okay," Ivy said, pacing off the boundaries of the common room with quick, practiced steps. "So, back home, my friends and I play this game called lightning tag. You need at least 4 people, but it's better with more." "Lightning," Oru repeated carefully, the word clearly unfamiliar in translation, his 4 eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to picture it. "This is a weather phenomenon on your world. Yeah, big electrical storms. They happen a lot where I live, especially in summer." Ivy said this the way someone might mention that it rains sometimes, entirely without weight. "So the game is basically regular tag, but you play it during a storm, in a big open field, and the rule is you're not allowed to be the tallest thing standing when the lightning flashes." The room went very quiet. "During the storm," Pharaoh said slowly, "an actual storm, with actual lightning." "Well, yeah, that's the whole point," Ivy said, clearly not understanding why this needed clarifying. "If it's not actually storming, it's just regular tag, and regular tag isn't as fun. The rule only matters because the lightning's real. You've got maybe 2 or 3 seconds between the flash and figuring out if you need to drop down or get away from a tree, and whoever's it has to tag someone before everyone finds cover, and if you get caught standing too tall when the sky lights up, some of the older kids say you're basically it whether you got tagged or not, because that's what would actually happen." Nobody in the room spoke for a long moment. I found myself replaying her words slowly, trying to reconcile the easy, casual tone of her explanation with the sheer, staggering danger of what she was actually describing. A game, played by children, during a lightning storm, where the central mechanic involved judging, in real time, whether you were standing in a position that made you a viable target for a naturally occurring electrical discharge capable of ending a life in an instant. "Do children," Oru said, very carefully, "ever get hurt playing this game?" Ivy's expression shifted slightly, the easy brightness dimming just a little, replaced by something more sober, more careful. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not usually badly. Mostly it's more that you get soaked and muddy, and your parents are mad you were out in a storm at all. But yeah, there was a kid 2 towns over, a few years back, that got hurt pretty bad. Everybody's parents made a bigger deal about the rules after that." "A bigger deal about the rules," Ren repeated, his voice faint. "There were already rules for this." "Of course there were rules," Ivy said, as though this should have been obvious. "You don't play near metal fences. You don't play under the tallest tree in the field because it's the most likely target, and if it gets hit, falling branches are dangerous too. You don't play if there's already been a strike close by, because storms can double back. There's a whole system. It's not just running around randomly. that would actually be really dangerous. She said this last part with genuine emphasis, as though the truly reckless version of the game, the one without careful rules governing exactly how close to danger a child was permitted to stand, was the real cause for concern, rather than the underlying premise of the game itself. I looked around the room slowly, taking in the expressions of every crew member present. Faro had gone very still, his earlier bravado entirely replaced now by something that looked unmistakably like quiet horror. Ren's mouth was slightly open, an expression I had never seen on his face in 6 cycles of serving alongside him. Oru's neck ridges had taken on a pale, unsettled shimmer that I recognized from only the most severe crisis drills our ship had ever run. "That is not the only game like this, is it?" I said, though I already suspected the answer with a certainty that felt like cold water settling into my chest. Ivy shook her head, apparently encouraged rather than discouraged by our reactions, mistaking our horrified silence for simple, rapt attention. "There's a bunch. Cliff jump is another one, but that one's mostly older kids. My parents don't let me do that one yet. You climb up to different ledges above a swimming spot, and everyone picks how high they're brave enough to jump from, and you're not supposed to go higher than the last person who actually landed okay. There's this game called Floor is Lava that little kids play just around furniture, which is totally safe, but the older version some kids play is out on actual rock formations near where I live, jumping between real ledges instead of couch cushions, pretending the ground between them is dangerous, except some of the gaps are pretty far apart, so it's not really pretend the whole time." "Not really pretend the whole time," Faro echoed faintly. "And there's Forest Run," Ivy continued, apparently warming to the subject now, her earlier caution entirely forgotten, in the simple pleasure of describing something she clearly loved. "That one's more for kids a little older than me, but I've watched my cousin do it. You go into the woods near dusk, when it's harder to see, and everyone splits up and has to make it back to a meeting point before full dark, without using lights, because using a light means you lose. It teaches you to move quiet and pay attention to sound instead of sight. There's bears in those woods, and coyotes, so you're not really supposed to do it completely alone, but the whole game is kind of about learning how to move through somewhere that could have something dangerous in it, without panicking." I realized, somewhere in the middle of her explanation, that I had stopped breathing normally, that my breathing had shifted into the shallow, careful rhythm my species uses when confronting something the body has identified as an immediate threat, even though nothing in that small common room had physically changed at all. The threat, I understood slowly, was not in the room. It was in the calm, easy voice of a 9-year-old girl, describing what amounted to a structured survival curriculum, disguised entirely, completely, and apparently sincerely, as ordinary childhood play. "These games," Oru said, his voice unusually strained, "they are not considered dangerous where you are from." Ivy paused, actually pausing to think about the question properly this time, rather than answering immediately. "I mean, I guess they're a little dangerous," she admitted. "But most fun stuff kind of is, right? You just learn the rules that keep it from being too dangerous. That's basically what growing up is, learning where the actual line is, instead of just being told to stay away from everything that could maybe be a little risky." She looked around the room then, finally seeming to register, for the first time, the sheer intensity of the silence surrounding her, the wide, unblinking eyes of nearly a dozen alien crew members staring at her, with expressions she clearly did not know how to interpret. "Is this like a lot?" she asked, some small note of genuine uncertainty finally entering her voice, the first crack in her earlier confidence all day. "I didn't mean to freak everyone out. I thought you wanted to see it." "We did," I said quietly, finding my voice with some effort. "We do. Please, continue. I think we simply did not expect this." Ivy studied our faces for a moment longer, clearly trying to gauge whether we were being truthful, before slowly, carefully, continuing her description, this time with a bit more caution in her voice, as though she had only just realized, watching our reactions, that the games she had grown up considering perfectly normal might land very differently on ears unaccustomed to them. I sat there, listening to her describe rules built around lightning strikes and cliff heights and unlit forests at dusk, and I felt something shift permanently in my understanding of the small, calm species that had just quietly, without any apparent malice or intent to alarm, revealed to an entire ship's crew exactly what kind of world had raised them. And it was not a world that had spared its children from danger. It was a world that had taught its children, from the earliest possible age, exactly how to survive it. And somewhere in that distinction, I understood, lay the answer to every question we had been asking since Ivy Sutton first stepped off that shuttle with a calm, unbothered expression that none of us had understood, until now. Captain Vesic summoned the senior crew to a briefing room less than an hour later, and I understood immediately, from the tightness in his posture, that word of the afternoon's events had already reached him in full. I had not expected to be included in a senior briefing, being only a systems engineer of modest rank, but Vesic had specifically requested my presence, along with Oru, Ren, and Faro, the four of us who had spent the most direct time in Ivy's company. We filed into the small room in silence, and I noticed, immediately, that Vesic had a datapad in front of him, its screen filled with dense text that I recognized, after a moment, as an old intelligence briefing on human physiology and behavior, one of the standard documents distributed to command staff decades earlier, when humanity first entered wider galactic awareness. I have been reading through our archived files on this species, Vesic said without preamble, ever since I received the report about the incident with Envoy Sela's daughter. I want to know if what I am reading matches what the four of you witnessed today. He turned the datapad toward us, and I leaned forward to read the passage he had highlighted, a section near the beginning of the document, written decades ago by some long-departed analyst who had clearly struggled to find the appropriate tone for what they were documenting. Human children, the passage read, mature in an environment containing significantly higher rates of naturally occurring hazard than nearly any other spacefaring species surveyed to date. Extreme weather, dangerous wildlife, and geological instability remain present across large portions of their homeworld, despite considerable technological advancement. Rather than isolating younger members of their species from these hazards entirely, human culture appears to favor a structured, graduated exposure model wherein children are taught, from a very early age, practical survival responses to dangers that other species would consider entirely unsuitable for any youngling to encounter. The long-term psychological and behavioral effects of this approach remain poorly understood, though preliminary observation suggests it produces adults with unusually high thresholds for stress response, exceptional situational awareness, and a notable absence of the fear responses typically expected when confronting sudden danger. The room was silent as we all finished reading. "That is what we witnessed," I said quietly. Once it became clear, no one else intended to speak first. "Precisely that. She described games, Captain, recreational activities. Structured, apparently, around active weather hazards, dangerous terrain, and reduced visibility conditions in wildlife territory. She did not describe them as unusual. She described them as normal, and seemed genuinely surprised that we found them alarming." Vesic set the datapad down slowly, and for the first time since I had served under him, I saw something on his broad features that I would have described, in any other context, as unease bordering on fear. "There is a section further in this document," he said, "regarding humanity's military history. I confess I never read it closely before today. It did not seem relevant to a peaceful trade negotiation with a species so recently introduced to wider galactic contact." He tapped the datapad, and another passage appeared, longer, denser, filled with the careful, clinical language analysts use when trying to describe something they themselves clearly found unsettling. "I do not think," Faro said slowly, "that we need to read further, Captain. I believe we understand the shape of what is being described." "Say it plainly," Vesic said. "I want it said plainly, in this room, so that none of us can later claim we misunderstood the situation." Oru was the one who finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, his four eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance, rather than on any of us directly. "We assumed," he said, "because human technology is comparatively young, and because their diplomatic presence in wider space has been limited thus far, that they were, in some fundamental sense, a fragile species, soft, unaccustomed to danger, unprepared for hardship, requiring caution and gentleness in our dealings with them, the way one might handle a species only recently emerged from a sheltered evolutionary path. They are not fragile, Ren said, picking up the thread, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone still processing a realization too large to fully absorb. They simply do not advertise what they are, because to them, none of it is remarkable. A child on this ship, alone, surrounded by armed strangers from a dozen unfamiliar species, remained entirely calm throughout an unauthorized predator simulation, an unauthorized emergency drill, and a conversation about weather-based combat games that she considers ordinary recreation. Because compared to what she has apparently already survived simply by growing up on her homeworld, none of what we attempted today registered as a genuine threat. An adult version of that same child, Vesic said quietly, trained, presumably, in whatever their society considers appropriate preparation for actual danger, having grown up already accustomed to lightning, dangerous wildlife, unstable terrain, and whatever other hazards their world regularly presents, would represent what, precisely, in a genuine conflict scenario? Nobody answered him immediately, because none of us wanted to be the one to say it aloud, though I suspect every person in that room had already arrived at the same conclusion independently. Something considerably more dangerous than we were prepared to imagine, I finally said, when the ambassador first requested we care for his daughter for a few hours. Vesic nodded slowly, and something in his expression settled into a grim, careful resolve, the look of a commander recalculating a strategic picture that had just shifted dramatically beneath him. I want every crew member who interacted with the girl today debriefed individually, he said. Not as punishment. I want to understand exactly what we observed, in detail, while it remains fresh. And I want a formal note sent to command, flagging our previous intelligence assessments on humanity as significantly outdated. Whatever assumptions informed our diplomatic posture toward this species need to be revisited immediately, before we, or any allied fleet, make a far more serious miscalculation than a failed prank in a guest corridor. Captain, Faro said carefully, should we be concerned? Diplomatically, I mean. If word of today's incidents reaches Ambassador Sutton, particularly the drill sequence involving his daughter and the young Vertani girl. Vesic considered this for a long moment. I intend to inform him myself, honestly and fully, rather than allow him to hear a distorted version through other channels. I suspect, he added, with something almost like dry humor beneath the tension in his voice, that he will not be nearly as alarmed by any of this as we currently are. I thought of Ivy's earlier comment, dismissed at the time as a simple childish remark. She has been on worse ships than this. I understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in my chest, that the ambassador had not been exaggerating, and had not been careless in leaving his daughter in our care. He had simply understood, in a way none of us had, that whatever discomforts or dangers our ship might present, his daughter had already been equipped, by the simple fact of her upbringing, to handle them without difficulty. We were not dealing with a fragile child who had gotten fortunate. We were dealing with the baseline. An entirely ordinary representative of an entire species raised, generation after generation, in circumstances that would be considered a survival crisis on nearly every other world in known space, and who had, as a result, developed a threshold for danger, fear, and hardship that none of us had ever needed to develop ourselves. I left that briefing room with a very different understanding of the small, calm girl still waiting in our guest quarters than the one I had carried into it. I thought of the alarms that had not startled her, the predator simulation she had critiqued for its clumsy gait, the emergency drill she had walked a terrified younger child through with the calm expertise of someone repeating a well-practiced lesson, and the games, the simple, ordinary childhood games, that had left an entire senior briefing room in stunned, careful silence. I understood, finally, why the galaxy's oldest and most established powers had approached humanity's emergence into wider space with such visible caution, despite humanity's relatively young technology and modest fleet presence. It was never about what humans could build. It was about what their worlds had already built into them, quietly, patiently, one dangerous childhood at a time, long before any of them ever set foot on a ship like ours. Ambassador Sutton arrived to collect his daughter just as the ship's evening cycle began, his negotiations finally concluded, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent hours arguing carefully worded clauses with people who did not share his species' sense of urgency. He found Ivy exactly where we had left her, sitting cross-legged on the bunk in the guest quarters, deck of cards spread out in some complex private game, stuffed bear propped against the pillow beside her, entirely at ease, as though the events of the afternoon had left no lasting impression on her at all. Was she any trouble? He asked, and there was something in his tone, a faint, knowing warmth, that suggested he already suspected the answer, or at least suspected that trouble, in this context, meant something very different to him than it might mean to us. Captain Vesic, who had come personally to oversee the handoff rather than delegating the task, chose his words with visible care. "Your daughter," he said slowly, "was remarkably composed throughout several situations that would have distressed most younglings considerably. I feel it is my duty to inform you that some members of my crew behaved inappropriately toward her during the visit, running unauthorized simulations without proper consent, and I take full responsibility for that failure of oversight." Ambassador Sutton's expression shifted slightly, not toward anger, as I had half expected, but toward something closer to weary amusement, the look of a parent who has heard some version of this story many times before, on many different worlds. "Let me guess," he said. "Someone tried to scare her with a monster simulation, and she asked technical questions about it instead of being frightened." Vesic blinked, clearly caught off guard by the accuracy of the guess. "Something very close to that, yes. And then someone ran an emergency drill, maybe without proper warning, and instead of panicking, she ended up helping calm down some other kid who actually was scared." "That also happened," Vesic admitted, his composure visibly shaken by how casually the ambassador was describing events that had thrown his entire senior crew into a state of quiet crisis less than an hour earlier. Ambassador Sutton sighed, though the sound carried more fondness than frustration, and crossed the room to help Ivy gather her things, scooping the stuffed bear up and tucking it gently back into her blue bag. "I'm sorry if she caused any concern," he said, glancing back at us. "I probably should have warned you. She's not trying to unsettle anyone. She genuinely doesn't understand why any of this would be alarming. It's just how she grew up. It's just how most of our kids grow up, honestly." "You are not concerned," I found myself asking, unable to stop the question from leaving my mouth, "that your daughter has already encountered dangerous wildlife, severe storms, and what sounds like a rather significant amount of ordinary risk at only 9 years of age?" The ambassador considered the question seriously, pausing in his packing to look at me directly, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of careful honesty that I had not expected from a diplomat used to careful, measured public statements. "I worry about it constantly," he admitted. "Every parent does, where we're from. But the alternative isn't really available to us. Our world simply has more hazards in it than a lot of the worlds your people call home. We can't remove the storms. We can't remove the wildlife. We tried, historically, other approaches, keeping children sheltered entirely from any danger until adulthood, and it turns out that produces adults who panic badly the first time they encounter something genuinely dangerous, at an age when panicking is far more likely to get them killed. So instead, we teach children early, carefully, with rules and supervision, exactly how to recognize danger and respond to it without falling apart. It's not that we don't value safety, it's that we've had to define safety a little differently than some other species might." He finished packing Ivy's bag and helped her down from the bunk, and she came to stand beside him with the easy, unbothered posture of a child at the end of an ordinary day, giving no sign at all that she had spent the last several hours quietly, unknowingly, dismantling every assumption our crew had carried about her entire species. "Did you have fun?" the ambassador asked her, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. "Yeah," Ivy said, brightening. "I showed them lightning tag. They got really quiet." The ambassador huffed out a small laugh, glancing up at Vesic with something almost apologetic in his expression. "She has that effect on people," he said. "It usually takes a while for it to sink in, exactly what she's describing. I remember the first time I explained it to a Threll colleague of mine, years ago. Took him almost a full day to stop looking pale every time he saw me afterward. Vesik did not respond immediately, and I understood, watching him, that he was still very much in the process of that same slow, unsettling realization, the one that had taken hold of our entire senior briefing less than an hour earlier and had not yet fully released its grip. "Thank you," the ambassador said, extending a hand toward Vesik in the traditional human gesture of goodwill, "for looking after her. I know it probably wasn't the quiet, easy afternoon your crew expected." "No," Vesik agreed, shaking the offered hand slowly, his expression carefully composed but his eyes betraying something far more complicated beneath the surface. "It was not." They departed shortly afterward, Ivy waving cheerfully at the small crowd of crew members who had gathered, once again, near the hangar bay to watch her go, entirely unaware of the magnitude of what she had left behind her. I watched the shuttle depart from the observation bay, the same place I had been standing when she first arrived, and I found myself thinking about how differently I understood that first moment now, compared to how I had understood it only a few hours earlier. Word of the day's events spread through the wider diplomatic network faster than any of us expected. Within days, other ships across the sector were requesting the full incident report, curious officers and cautious commanders alike wanting to understand exactly what had transpired aboard the Long Horizon during what should have been an unremarkable few hours of childcare. The story of the human girl who could not be frightened, who calmly critiqued a predator simulation, who guided a terrified younger child through a false emergency without a hint of panic, and who described her own childhood games in terms that left an entire ship's crew in stunned silence, became something closer to legend, repeated and reshaped across a dozen different species communication channels. I do not know, even now, exactly how the wider galaxy will come to understand humanity in the years and decades ahead, as more of their ships venture further into shared space, as more of their diplomats sit across tables from cautious, careful representatives of older, more established powers. I only know what I witnessed, firsthand, aboard my own ship, on an afternoon that began as a simple favor for a distracted ambassador and ended with an entire senior crew quietly, permanently reconsidering everything they believed about the softness of newly encountered species. Ivy Sutton was not remarkable among her own people. That, I have come to understand, is precisely the point. She was simply a child, raised on a world that never had the luxury of sheltering its young from danger, taught from her earliest years exactly how to stand steady in the face of things that would send most other species' children into panic, and sent off into the wider galaxy, entirely unaware that her calm, ordinary composure would be enough to quietly, thoroughly frighten every alien who ever tried to test it. We had tried, that afternoon, to see what it would take to frighten the human girl. Instead, without ever intending to, without even fully realizing she had done it, she showed us exactly what it meant to grow up on a world that never stopped trying to kill you. And precisely why, when the ambassadors finally stopped talking and the treaties were finally signed, every careful, cautious species in known space would remember, for a very long time, never to underestimate what a Deathworld child considers nothing more than an ordinary game.